YouTube. Esto es YouTube.
Welcome to Global Justice Report, brought to you by the Center for Global Justice. We welcome members, friends, and new listeners to this weekly report every Monday at 1 o'clock Central Time. I'm Cliff Durand, your host, and there I am. For today's program, which will be on the struggle over global hegemony, the Green New Deal, and authoritarian capitalism. The Center for Global Justice is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world. Since 2004, we have offered educational programs in English for expats and visitors alike, programs in Spanish for the Mexican community. We've also organized educational travel to Chiapas and to Cuba. Our vision is to move control of economic life and relations with Mother Earth from the 1% to the 99%. Coronavirus has set in relief the failures of neoliberal capitalism. Our weekly Global Justice Report will explore various grassroots democratic movements, including self-management, cooperatives, mutual aid, public banking, and more. If you have suggestions for future webinars, type them into the chat box. Well, actually, we've decided not to use the chat box. Many people seem to have trouble accessing that. And so what we would like to do, if you have questions or suggestions, to instead send us an email. I'll be monitoring this email account during the presentations. And if you have questions, you can send them to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And then after the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session where I will pass your questions on to our speakers. So global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. With globalization, capitalism has undergone an epochal shift. No longer rooted in national economies, capital has become transnational. Large corporations roam the globe looking for cheap, compliant labor and resources, establishing production chains running through many nations. Similarly, investors can move their capital from country to country with a few keystrokes on the computer. We can now see a truly transnational capital controlled by a transnational capitalist class that owes no allegiance to any nation. Nevertheless, there are progressive forces opposing elite domination of the system. They are rallying around a Green New Deal program that responds to the challenge of catastrophic climate change. Allied with them are activists struggling for a third reconstruction against racialized capitalism. However, moving in the opposite direction is a growing right-wing populism. It is on this contested terrain that the class struggle for global hegemony is being fought out. Today's speakers will visit this terrain. They are social critics Jerry Harris and Carl Davidson. Jerry Harris is National Secretary of the Global Studies Association. He has published this book, Global Capitalism and the Crisis for Democracy, as well as the dialectics of globalization, economic and political struggle in a transnational era. Our second speaker, Carl Davidson, was a student leader of the New Left in the 1960s. Some of our audience will remember those days. Today, he is a national co-chair of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism, and a national board member of Solidarity Economy Network, advocating market socialism with worker ownership. With Jerry Harris, he co-authored Cyber Radicalism, a New Left for a Global Age. We will hear first from Jerry Harris, speaking for probably about 20 minutes or so. And after that, we'll hear from Carl Davidson. During the break in between, I will display once again the email address that your question should go to. But for now, let me turn the floor over to Jerry.
Great. Well, glad to be with everybody today. And I think a good starting place when we talk about the struggle for global hegemony is maybe to define what we mean by hegemony itself. And here, Carl and I are working off of the great Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. And Gramsci wrote that really the capitalist class puts together a broad alliance, what he called a hegemonic bloc, that reaches consensus with major sectors of the capitalist class, but also encompasses important sectors of the working class and the middle class. And for those who don't get along or go along, there's the repressive apparatus of the state. And these blocks are built around a model of accumulation and around a model of social relations. So let me give you two brief examples. I think that will help make it clear. Keynesianism, of course, grew out of the Great Depression, and the Roosevelt, what we call a Keynesian social bloc, based on national industrial production and a social contract that was able to incorporate demands from the women's movement and the civil rights movements and from the labor movement. While on the other hand, they purged the Communist Party out of the labor unions and came down full force against the Black Panther Party. In other words, the repressive aspect of the state against the most radical. You know, that was replaced in the 1980s by neoliberalism. And neoliberalism was based on these global assembly lines, transnational production, as well as breaking the social contract, austerity and part-time and temporary work and this type of thing. So that hegemonic bloc, which has lasted now for about 40 years, really started to go into crisis with the 2008 economic meltdown. And at that point, members of the capitalist class started to search around and discuss new ways to stabilize capitalism, new ways to find a historic new round of accumulation, et cetera. And I think there's essentially two emerging contending blocks. The first one, authoritarian capitalism, there's been quite a lot written about reactionary nationalism. We're all familiar with Trump and others around the world like Bolsonaro and Brazil. So we're not going to talk a lot about that unless we have time, because we think people are pretty familiar with it. But in the questions, we'll certainly be happy to go into it. Where we would like to focus a little more attention is on the green capitalist reformist bloc, because we really don't see much about this as an emerging hegemonic bloc within the capitalist class. And from my point of view, there's really three fractions within this emerging bloc. One is a neoliberal Greens And they are quite powerful and have a lot of lobby groups and corporate lobby groups that I can go into. There's a center forces around philanthropy and NGOs. And then there's the left, which is the Green New Deal, all the way to eco-socialists, like I think myself and Carl would consider ourselves. So I want to go into the neoliberal Greens and the philanthropy centrist Greens. And Carl is going to take on the Green New Deal folks. What's interesting here, if you think back to the Democratic primaries, I think for the first time we saw these three fractions clearly emerging in the presidential debates. You had Bloomberg representing the neoliberal Greens. We had Steyer and Governor Insel representing the centrist forces and the philanthropic and NGO approach. And of course, Warren and Sanders really representing the more radical Green New Deal approach. So we see the politics of this taking formation right in front of our eyes. So let me start with the green think tanks, NGOs, and the philanthropic funders as the center group. And I think what's so important about this group is that they're clearly articulating a post-neoliberal capitalist order quite consciously. And because of that, I think there's a possibility of a center-left alliance between, excuse me, between the Green New Deal and these folks. Now, just 6 foundations make up 70% of the philanthropic funding for green issues. And they also fund social issues. But these are the Hewlett Foundation, the Packard Foundation, yes, the Hewlett-Packard Company, both those families, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Energy Foundation, the Oak Foundation, and Sea Change. And where I want to start here is actually reading to you a bit of thinking from Larry Kramer, who's the CEO of the Hewlett Foundation, which is really one of the very largest, former dean of the Stanford Law School, because this guy Kramer really thinks strategically. And he thinks in terms of hegemonic blocks, although he doesn't use Gramsci in his language. So to give you a flavor of this, let me start out here. As he says, neoliberalism has proven unable to provide satisfactory answers to problems like wealth inequality, wage stagnation, economic dislocation, the loss of jobs, economic security. Circumstances are ripe for the emergence of a new intellectual paradigm, a different way to think about political economy, and the terms for a new 21st century social contract. Helping develop and communicate such ideas is a task well suited to philanthropy. And here, I think he was a student of the Koch brothers, actually, who funded the whole intellectual revolution of right-wing thinking through their right-wing philanthropy and establishing 65 think tanks, actually, over a period of time. Now, to give you an idea of the depth of their thinking, he goes on about the triumph of neoliberalism. And he notes how its victory was in favor of free market orthodoxy in the 70s and 80s, reshaped the entire world. Physical policy, monetary policy, labor policy, trade policy, welfare policy, industrial policy, and similarly colonized law, political science, sociology, psychology, anthropology, public policy, corporate governance, how workers and executives are paid, and how the financial sector operates. That's a pretty inclusive, deep understanding of hegemonic blocks and just how powerful neoliberalism is. And so when he talks about replacing neoliberalism, we're really looking at a pretty substantial political revolution on the part of the thinking of these folks. Just a few more things here. He says the triumph of market ideology did not occur organically. It was, in fact, an intentionally cultivated and, most importantly, well-funded effort. The free market movement was paid for, backed every step of the way by sympathetic foundations and philanthropies who provided the resources to succeed. That's, of course, people like the Koch family and others. So he also blames both the Democrats and Republicans for accepting this ideology. What Kramer lacks in his thinking is an appreciation for the mass movement. So it's really sort of an elite strategy to develop the organic intellectual, as Gramsci would call them, the organic intellectuals of the new post-neoliberal sort of capitalism. Now, to just give you a flavor of what these philanthropies do, the Hewlett Foundation, as I said, was one of the biggest, but the Packard Foundation has given out about $930 million to NGOs, funding 193 organizations in 14 different countries. And much of their alumni runs through Stanford University. And in fact, when you look at these folks on these boards of all these philanthropies, Stanford is a very common network for all of them, as well as West Coast Tech Capital. Sea Change was started by Nathan Simmons, who was a Silicon Valley investment guy worth about $11 billion, ranked 74th richest person in the world, and launched what he called Climate Action 100 Plus, a group of 320 investors with over $33 trillion in assets, pressuring corporations to move away from greenhouse emissions. The Energy Foundation, which is centered in San Francisco, where so many of these are, was really a unique creation that is a conduit for other foundations taking in grants and then distributing funds. So Hewlett, Packard, Sea Change, McKnight, MacArthur, Google, Bloomberg, Schmidt, who used to be CEO of Google, they're all funders of these guys. 30,000 grants, over 1.2 billion to 12,000 recipients. Now the Rockefeller Foundation, plus the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, they have two wings. Their board members have the most corporate backgrounds. A lot of the backgrounds of these other boards are academic and governmental. But just to give you a flavor here of the Rockefellers, they have people from Providence, Equity, Citigroup, Starbucks, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Yi-Fei Li, who's chair of the Man Group in China, which is one of the world's largest hedge fund managers with 60 billion, the Carlyle Group. And here's Stephen Hines, who's president of the Rockefeller Group, a shorter quote from him. But when he talks about the systemic crisis, he says it stems from the growing obsolescence of three core operating systems that have shaped civilization for the past 350 years. The first, capitalism, fueled by carbon since the dawn of the industrial age and driven by global financialization. The nation state system from the Westphalia in 1648, and representative democracy, our practice of capitalism is both putting the planetary ecosystem at risk, generating vast economic inequality. Nation states are inadequate for managing the challenges, and representative democracy is neither truly representative nor very democratic, as citizens feel the self-rule has given way to rule by corporations and the wealthy. probably a statement that could go easily on Cliff's Global Justice Center. So these give you an idea of how serious these center forces are. I don't consider them social fascists, as some on the left do. I think there's plenty of room here for some type of political unity and common work. There's others here, but let me move on to the corporate funding policy groups. And there's really some of these groups have been around for a while. But the main reason I would include them, even though they're neoliberal Greens, in a general emerging bloc, which the left may be part of, is because they are actively building out the means of production of the green industrial base. They're the ones building out solar, wind, batteries, green infrastructures, and financing it, something that the left is pretty incapable of doing right now, although I would hope that we are promoting and helping to develop cooperative ownership in solar businesses, et cetera. Just to give you a flavor here, probably the most influential is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which was established for transnational CEOs and tied to the International Chamber of Commerce. Their corporate board has representatives from 48 energy corporations, 5 exclusively green energy, but the other 43 have fossil fuel. The next largest group on their board are consultants, law firms, accountant firms, lobbyists, advisors, legal representatives of companies concerned with energy and the environment, and banks and financial institutions have about 23 representatives. These, and I'm quoting here from actually a student of William Carroll, who's a transnational theorist, a guy named Philip Spazzinski, says that these corporate elites that seek to establish a new base of accumulation within a broadly neoliberal order. Hence, the stated goal of climate capitalism is in the long term, is to divert financial flows from oil and coal and redirect them to support ecological modernization of capitalist production processes. Corporate funding activities are crucial to conceptualize the new regime, mobilizing broad corporate elite support, as well as a network to assemble an essential infrastructure around which climate capitalism can organize. But they are thoroughly neoliberal in their attitude towards labor, in their pro-market attitudes. They don't want much government regulation. And so obviously there's plenty of room here for a struggle. They sort of want to save the planet. They just don't want to do it by treating labor well. And so we have here, I see 2 or 3 minutes left. I think 2 very distinct wings of a green reformist capitalism. And the thing that I think weakens this emerging bloc is they don't have a consolidated view around the social relations. The authoritarian bloc is consolidated around militarized accumulation, repressive accumulation, surveillance technologies, internment camps, military industrial complex, a prison industrial complex, and they have a concept of social relations based on repressive neo-fascist social policies. The emerging green bloc, unfortunately, is still split between these post-neoliberal centrists and the neoliberal folks like Bloomberg. So although they're united in terms of having a vision of a green accumulation model, they're not united in terms of what the social relations and labor relations would look like. That's where I think, and I'll turn it over to Carl here, the Green New Deal can play such an important role, because the Green New Deal ties social justice to environmental justice. And the center forces also accept the idea of social justice as part of the post-neoliberal order. So I think that's the core of the alliance. And over time, depending how the struggle goes, where we want to direct it eventually, of course, is as a transition to an eco-socialist future. But I think participating and thinking about this emerging bloc and participating in it is a way to step through that door towards that more fundamental and revolutionary transformation. So let me turn it over to Carl to go on. Thank you.
Well, it's very interesting, and I thank you, Jerry, for this overview. Before we go on to Carl, I do want to share the screen of the email address where you can send your questions, either for Jerry or for Carl. So, by the way, speaking of the rise of authoritarianism, we have a webinar planned on that coming up on the 28th of September. If you check our schedule on the Global Justice website, you'll see that we details on that, as well as other webinars. Some of them are still in the planning stage. They're not posted yet. Okay, let me turn the floor now over to Carl Davidson. I'm very delighted to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Cliff. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to use some slides I put together to go through some of the things I want to talk about. I'm going to take a different view from Jerry, not a different political view, but I'm going to try to show you from the bottom up what it means to construct a Green New Deal, a counter-hegemonic bloc. So let me share my screen here, and we'll dig into it. There we go. So what it is and how we can get it, the counter-hegemonic bloc from the bottom up. First, what is it? The Green New Deal is a much contested concept. People define it in different ways. What I've done here is to try to take out what I consider 7 key points about what makes up the Green New Deal, to deal with the different kinds of crises it's caused the ecosystem. The planet will survive no matter what we do. The real question is whether the habitat inside of that planet, inside the ecosystem, is sustainable for human beings. So point number 1 in the Green New Deal that everybody talks about is the need to transition away from burning carbon. Hopefully this will halt the growth of the amount of CO2. And it's everything from all different kinds of energies down to planting lots of different trees. The second point is the need to distribute all energies worldwide. It's especially important that we address the inequalities between the global north and south on all sorts of things, especially energy. And part of that will require a new global grid, a global energy grid that enables energy to be distributed to just about everywhere, but the redistribution of renewable energy, not energy from the burning of carbon and uranium. There's all sorts of other things having to do with high design, redesigning and rebuilding industries so there's zero waste, so that the waste product coming out of one industry is the raw materials product for another. Agribusiness has to be transformed from the current factory farms, which are terribly unsustainable, to more organic, sustainable farms on a smaller scale. Housing has to be redesigned and retrofit so that they're waste energy. There has to be increased innovation and high design for all products and services, especially those made out of plastics. 90% of things made out of plastic can be made out of bamboo or glass. This is a question of designing them and making the switch. And we have to curb the production of poisons towards zero. Barry Commoner, one of the founders of ecology, once said that the best way to deal with poisons is not to make them in the first place. So those are just like some of the things that we're talking about when we mean the Green New Deal. That would be part and parcel of a comprehensive program of it. But where does it begin? It mainly begins locally, and that means just about every locale you can start with, no matter what part of the globe you're on what section of a country you're in. So I picked a place where I live and grew up, which is Western Pennsylvania. And we just begin with some of the contradictions there, but there are all sorts of places where these contradictions come up. The picture here of this huge plant being constructed. They tore down a bunch of other plants a few years ago, and Shell Oil came in spending billions of dollars building a huge hydrocarbon plant here that basically takes fracked natural gas and turns it into plastic. And in order to feed this plant, it takes 1,000 fracking wells across the tri-state area of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and parts of Ohio. They're called the Marcellus Shale. And it's basically the natural gas is used for energy, generally speaking. You can see the smoke coming up from a couple smokestacks there on the horizon that are still burning coal. And the idea is that eventually these will have to burn natural gas. But it's still putting carbon in the air. And in terms of plastic that comes out of the Shell cracker plant here, it's called a cracker. Means that you can take the ethane gas and turn it into little plastic pellets. It's a high degree of pollution comes from not only the plant itself but also the plastics. Plastic has a half-life of 500 years or so. So that's one side of it. That's the anti-green side of what's going on in our county. But right below it is a picture of a wind farm up in the mountains not too far from here in Bedford County. And the fact that these things exist show what Jerry was talking about. These things are not owned by workers or co-ops or anything. They're owned by green capitalists who've decided that that they don't really care how they make their money. They can make money from renewable solar, wind, or whatever. They'll make money that way too. Now, this is a capitalist firm for making green energy. So it exists side by side along with the others. The other picture there is a barge, and it's another way we define green New Deal around here. Part of our Green New Deal package is that we want to modernize all the locks and dams on the Ohio and the other two rivers leading into it. And by modernizing them, we can put in larger river traffic for transport of all sorts of things. But right now, those things are being transported by 18-wheeler trucks on the interstate highways. But if you can transport them on water like this, the amount of pollution that goes into them is greatly reduced. And so these working to modernize these locks and dams and the expansion of transportation on the river is considered our green jobs. So, but here's the contradiction that comes in, and how do we fight it? We have a Marcellus coalition that's fighting against the cracker plant. It's a militant minority in our county. But at the same time, the workers that work in there are not sympathetic at all. They've traded off their health for jobs for going back to the beginning of the steel industry. Believe me, there's nothing more poisonous than making steel. And so we have a contradiction. that exist among the people themselves and within the workers themselves. Because on the one hand, they know that they need a paycheck. On the other hand, they know that what they're doing is not necessarily good for their families or their community living into the future. So we have a fight on our hands. There's a fight needed to win over certain sections, but the only way we're going to win over these workers in the working at the Shell cracker is to present to them not a good idea of what a green job could be, but actual green jobs. So they have to be passed and funded, and they have to be ready at hand. Otherwise, rather than just a good idea for workers to take them seriously. Once that would happen, you would find lots of people leaving this. I don't know a single coal miner who wouldn't rather be doing something else for a living. So this is where the fight begins, and it's the base. And the problem is that the Shell's billions have bought off most of the Pennsylvania legislature and a lot of the local leaders. So we really have to begin by building the Green New Deal majority on the city and county level of our first stop. And from there, we have to begin to take an assessment of it to find how we can build a political will. As the president, we are a militant minority. So this is an assessment pretty much of the lay of the land at the moment of where we can find support for the Green New Deal among registered voters. And you can see that among all registered voters, there is a 81% soft support for the Green New Deal, but the real core of it is still militant minority. It's just 40% down here. Among Democrats, you can see that we have a solid support among the majority of Democrats. And we have about a third of the independents, but much less of the Republican Party. And here among liberal Democrats, we have even more, and so on. You could begin to see it. And then over here, you see the opposition. So the last two columns show that the Republicans are our adversaries, but even they are not without their weak spots. So to oversimplify the strategy is that we have to elect Democrats. We have to defeat Republicans, but this is not enough. We have to become a strong overall majority. So we have to start with state government. Now, state government is particularly important for a number of reasons, but I want to say something first. We rarely win things at the top that we haven't already won at the lower levels. That's why it's important to win Green New Deal majorities on the county level and the city level, because that begins to be your base community, your base area. So this chart is a current survey of 2019 of state governments' rankings on their attitudes towards solar and renewable powers. And if you start up here at the top of this circle where you see it's all green, that's down here is a blowout of it. That's the report card for the state of Massachusetts. And it gets an A grade. And it shows that in the state of Massachusetts, you have, the Green New Deal bloc pretty much has hegemony in the state of Massachusetts. But as you go around, you begin to see lots of other states where there's a great deal of difficulties. And over here, you see that in these states, you're in deep trouble. So there's a lot of work that has to be done. The states are very important because they not only do the state governments draw the congressional district lines that can be used to gerrymander, so that the working class majorities cannot come to power. So, for instance, in the state of Pennsylvania, we've just recently elected 4 DSA young women that ran on the Democratic ticket, and we got them sent off to Harrisburg. And one of the first things they did was they set up a climate caucus, and that climate caucus again pulled in about 20 more Democrats who are not democratic socialists, but just more progressive-minded or moderate-minded Democrats that they're concerned about climate, and they now have a foot in the legislature to begin to wage battle against that majority of them that are bought and paid for by by Shell and the fracking industry. So that shows you how the terrain shapes up on the state level. Here is the way it looks at the moment on the national level. There's a Green New Deal bloc in Congress, and this is as of March 2019. And it shows that we're still only a counter-hegemonic bloc. And here is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's the hero of the Green New Deal. Green New Deal was much discussed and debated among policy wonks and among inside the environmental movement. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC as we call her, she's the one who made it a household word. She put it on the kitchen table for everybody across the country. The first thing she did when we went into Congress, she plunked it down as a resolution for a Green New Deal resolution in the U.S. in the House of Representatives. And she partnered up over here with Ed Markey and also Bernie Sanders in the Senate as co-sponsors. And she began to argue for it. And again, in the beginning, it wasn't all that fleshed out. She just ran down a bunch of principles, sort of like I did. And the right wing attacked her, and she counterattacked and whipped their butts to be into the debates around it to be accurate. But you see over here in the House now, we have 91 co-sponsors. So that's, and in the Senate, we have 12. Now, there's 435 in the House altogether, and there's 100 in the Senate. So we see we have a big way to go in terms of environmental, getting to the progressive majority that we need. Why is this block so important? Because until we get a majority, a Green New Deal majority in both the Senate and the House, and a supermajority, depending on who's president, there's no funding for the Green New Deal. And without funding, there's no possibility of implementing it. So the biggest argument that comes up then is, well, how, people say, well, they like the idea of the Green New Deal, but who's going to pay for it? So the question is, people say we can't afford it. It's $50 to $100 trillion over 10 years. Well, the answer is that we can pay for it. I always like to give the example of one of the earliest Green New Deal projects, which was started by Franklin Roosevelt, was the Hoover Dam. And the question, well, how did Roosevelt pay for the Hoover Dam? He paid for it by writing a check. He didn't increase the taxes or anything. He expanded the money supply. But when you expand the money supply and you spend it on something productive, it comes back at you over time. And there's all sorts of other things that can be made to change the budgets, and the importance of, reallocation and redefining, and pointing out that a Green New Deal investments and the kind of infrastructure that it creates all create new value. They don't just make money; they make new value, and that's the important thing of the kinds of money that would be going into the kinds of Green New Deal changes. So the question is, there's plenty of reasons why we can pay for it and why it will come back and pay for itself in good time, as well as being necessary. So the last word to try to sum up on the thing, the point is that we can't afford not to fund and implement a Green New Deal, and we can't afford not to try to win these, even though it's difficult to win these step by step, to win these Green New Deal majorities locally, statewide, and then in the Congress. So we can't afford not to do it. We're starting to see all the different things that come from climate, just from doing nothing. This is a picture of crop failures out in the Midwest because of the variations in rainfall and things. There's down here in the lower level, there's unseasonal wildfires that are breaking out. Up over here, you can see this is what the North Pole used to look like back in 1985. Here's what it looks like in 2018, and you can see the ice cap, and now there's, for the summer at least, there's You can sail right through the Arctic Ocean. Here's unseasonal flooding. I just saw the other day that Bangladesh, because of flooding, there are millions of people now who are refugees. What this means is that it's not only a human problem. Even the Pentagon is taking a look at it now because they begin to see these mass transfers of human populations fleeing different impacts of the climate crisis. As they see them as a national security question as well, from areas that are no longer able to support human life, coming to places that will come. So all this is taking place, and it's getting worse. So the question is, what do these things cost? They have an enormous cost in terms of death and destruction that you can't even really put a price tag on. So there's an urgency, kind of urgency that's important to the Green New Deal, as it impacts people unevenly, as you can see from the people there in the corner fleeing, some flooded areas impacted. It tends to fall on people of color, has the heaviest burden in bearing the impact of all parts of the green. Every now and then you hear about the, houses in the Hollywood Hills burning, all these expensive things. But the biggest impact of the pollution and the wreckage caused by climate change falls heaviest on the lower income workers and the communities of color in general. So this is a part of the urgency behind it. It's why some of the biggest waves of protests recently have been around the emergent elemental upheavals. And so our problem is not so much to build these movements. The crises cause the capitalist outrages will build the movements. We have to build the organization, the kind of organization that will get those Green New Deal majorities elected so that we will then have some funds to do it. And doing that not only will require uniting the base communities, as Jerry pointed out, it will also require winning over a certain sector of allies among the upper crust itself. And some of them are, as he's pointed out, some of them are already breaking away because they understand the threat to the system. If we have to wait until we have socialism without any sort of allies at the top to combat the climate crisis, we're doomed. We have to start it now. And if we play our cards right, we will be able to implement the Green New Deal and with a kind of radical structural reforms that can serve as bridges to a new order. We'll have a tit-for-tat fight with some of our green capitalist allies along the way, but that's in the nature of things. So anyway, I hope that gives you an idea of what building a counter-hegemonic Green New Deal bloc from the bottom up implies.
Okay, thank you, Carl. We've seen it from the top. Now we've looked at it from the bottom. It's a gigantic project in any case, no matter how you look at it.
That's right.
Let me remind you that if you have a question or comment for either of our speakers, email it to me at global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And while you're doing that, we have the first question that has come in. Let me read it to you. Or actually, I'll share the screen so you can see it. Right here. This comes from Marty O'Malley, a retired attorney from who lives here in San Miguel. He suggests this probably to Carl, but either speaker. He writes, the green strategies discussed seem to be US-centric. Under the Chinese model set by Deng Xiaoping in 1978, China has created a new middle class that is larger than the entire population of Mexico and the US combined. Its transportation infrastructure, consisting of high-speed rail, robotic deep water ports, and integrated transportation hubs has linked the entire country and networked it into the global economy. Soon, its gross national product will surpass the US, and it will be the dominant manufacturing center of the world. Both the US and China are now competing to consume the traditional fossil fuel resources of the globe. Along with these two nations, India will be the largest population and third largest economy with enormous demand for natural resources. This is a tidal wave of global destruction, a doomsday scenario. Should we not be thinking more expansively on how to mobilize global support against this onslaught of destruction? How to achieve a green global consensus? All right, there's a question for you guys. I know that's.
I'll start off by
Okay.
saying that if you want to build a global alliance or consensus or a global project, the first thing you have to do is practice what you preach. Otherwise, people are not going to be paying attention to you. If you're not building, if you don't have a Green New Deal underway in your own country, if you're not taking it seriously, if you're storming out of a Paris conference on climate, and taking your marbles and go home, people are not going to listen to you. You're not going to be able to build any kind of alliance. So I would say step one is you have to begin to practice what you're preaching. And you do that by trying to implement the Green New Deal and the kinds of radical reconstruction at home. Once you do, there's a natural framework for building a global alliance, a worldwide alliance that has to accomplish all countries. And that's the global smart grid. It's the most key piece of infrastructure of all in building the Green New Deal is a global smart grid. The smart grid is different from a traditional electric grid. First of all, it's global. It reaches the whole world, and the whole world is tied into it. And the second thing about the smart grid is what makes it smart. On the existing energy grid, everything flows in one direction from a central power plant out. Everything is just flowing in one direction. The smart grid is two-way because feedback flows the other direction. In other words, it's got a built-in internet so that you can adjust how much energy you're using, giving the time of day to find the most. You have a little meter in your house where you can adjust. Well, I think I'll dry my clothes at night instead of in the middle of the day because it's a more efficient use of energy. So that's what makes it smart. And then once you get that to span the whole globe so that energy flows can be adjusted between night and day and so on. The sun doesn't shine at night. So it has to be intelligent. It has to be an intelligent grid. And this is the core piece, and it has to be built in all countries. And so it's a truly global project that has to begin. Once the smart grid is laid down and the global cooperation has grown on the basis of that, then I think it can be worked into other projects as well.
So I'd like to add to it the three factions of this emerging green bloc that we're talking about. They're global in nature. Neoliberal Greens exist all over. Those corporate lobby groups have transnational corporations from all over the world. Philanthropic funding, there's funding groups all over the world. And certainly the Green New Deal and the environmental left is transnational. I mean, just a year ago March, those wonderful youth marches all around the world with millions of people. China is also very interesting to think about because they're leading in every area of green technology. And they have some of the largest green transnational companies in the world in solar and wind and EV and electric, et cetera. And if you think about Trump's support of the fossil fuel industry and his consistent attacks on the EPA and all environmental regulations, and you think about that in terms of these emerging authoritarian bloc and green bloc context, I think that gives it strategic clarity of why Trump and authoritarian capitalism is so pro-fossil fuel and attacks the green efforts so viciously. It's a strategic battle for them. And that battle also goes on in China. There's the fossil fuel industries are powerful and have a lot of political clout, and yet at least you have a national leadership that understands science, as Xi calls for ecological civilization. So there's quite a lot of movement in that direction too. So the struggle is transnational in every sense of the word.
Marty O'Malley responded to Carl's comments by saying, yes, right on. We need to think locally as well as globally.
Very good slogan.
Right. Let's see, here is another question, or, well, a comment. Understanding the differences between green capitalists and the Green New Deal from bottom up is so important. Is this being taught in our schools? So much isn't. Well, you might add, not only is it being taught in our schools, is it part of the dominant media coverage of issues?
Yeah.
Well, it is actually, to a certain extent, it is coming up in small ways. Every kid knows how they had to do a science project at one time or another, and you use baking soda to make your volcano and other things that blew up. But a lot of kids these days, when they do their science projects, they actually take on green energy projects or anything things that have to do with all different aspects of the transformation related to climate. And it's very popular among young kids to do this. And sometimes they get strong support from their teachers and sometimes not. And sometimes it goes up to them winning different prizes. Look at the young woman from Sweden, Greta Thunberg. She comes out of that milieu. And there are others in other countries as well. Now, they don't get celebrated as much as they should be. But in the course of building the counter-hegemonic bloc, you have to pull in all your allies locally. If for instance, building it here in Beaver County, we created a project called Reimagine Beaver County, where we pulled in high school kids as well as adults and so on. And we spent 3 huge, long sessions with maps of different parts of the county and reimagining every aspect of it, and then finally drew it up into a whole plan. What we were presenting, how to reorganize our economy and how to do everything so that we could create a sustainable green Beaver County. And so finally, all of a sudden, the local economic development people said, "Wow, this is something how did this happen?" So they're starting to take it seriously. Whether it will get in, how far it will go in terms of the legislature, who knows? But the fact of the matter is that we were able to pull this through this kind of imagination and creative work. We're able to involve people that you wouldn't normally think you would.
Yeah, I mean, every high school has science classes. And I think a lot of those science classes are turning to study environmental sciences. I mean, teachers tend to be a pretty progressive lot of people. So I think there's actually a lot probably going on, if not from the Board of Education itself, I think probably on the grassroots levels of what's going on in the classroom. And I would add that to part of the local struggle. There's a lot of struggles over curriculum and what books are being used and elections to the Board of Ed. All those are local struggles where we should be involved in and integrating this type of curriculum throughout schools.
Okay, here's another question. The role that global indigenous and peasant knowledge might play in building counter-hegemonic blocs. This comes from Doug Morris.
Well, I'll start off by saying it's fundamental. Um, I was just thinking the other day um, when I saw that 250,000 bikers show up in a town in South Dakota for their rendezvous, and none of them wearing masks uh, or anything like it, and just creating one big party. And what it reminded me of is, what is it about our national character that such a thing could happen in the middle of a pandemic? And the conclusion I came to is that our origin is that of a settler state, a colonial settler state. And the attitude of the settler was that they could subdue nature. They could stand up to it and fight it and defeat it. They didn't have to live in harmony with it. And that these bikers showing up, were much like sort of the old rendezvous of the mountain men who would come out of the mountains once a year, and they would come to some Indian trading post once a year to trade their stories and their furs and whatnot before they went off again. So I saw all these bikers as kind of modern day mountain men, sort of practicing the kind of the opposite of what the kind of harmony, the harmony with the natural world that are represented by the culture of the native peoples. So we have to sort of rely on some of that and dig out that aspect of humanity in order to defeat the settler mentality. It's the idea that you can go in and through force of will or force of arms subdue nature.
Yeah, I would add, we've already seen the incredible impact that Standing Rock had on the entire movement, and indigenous input into the environmental struggle is, again, I think, transnational. We see it particularly in the Bien Vida that's put forward in Bolivia and Ecuador and in the Andes among indigenous people. So I think the environmental movement has learned quite a lot from indigenous philosophical and religious approaches to the relationship between human beings and nature as being part of it, as Carl has been going into, is it's totally opposite of the settler mentality. So, yeah, I mean, an essential part of that Green New Deal.
Here we have another word of appreciation from a listener, from Sharon Davidson. She writes, an excellent presentation, and particularly like the clear way Carl Davidson laid out the needs for the future in building a truly socialist Green New Deal that benefits the environment and labor and the people at the bottom of the economy. It's clear everyone must take part to build this green future. And I like that he explains we have to build from the county and state level up.
Oh, I'll just say thank you. You got it.
Let me put a question in here. A key part of the Green New Deal, as Jerry pointed out, is to transition away from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. And I was struck by the statement that came from BP just in the last week, I think it was. BP, British Petroleum, is saying that it is limiting its investment in fossil fuels, that it is moving out of fossil fuels, promoting the development of alternative energy. I guess this is consonant with its declaration, well, some years ago, that BP really stands for beyond petroleum. And it sounds like they're beginning to take that more seriously now. So what do you think of that move?
I think they're part of the neoliberal
Either.
greens that are looking for a way to transition their corporations into the capitalist future. How are they going to survive and keep accumulating? They know oil is a diminishing resource, and I wouldn't put it beyond many of them that they actually have some type of environmental consciousness. Just because they're capitalists, they still live on this planet. And I think their plan is transition by 2050, is it? Which is sort of in keeping with the long view of what some of the stuff that's come out of the UN. But that's very much part of when you look at these corporate lobby groups, you'll see a lot of these energy groups are in there trying to manage and engineer what the transition will look like, how they can keep their money, how to sort of slow the pace so they can make use of their fossil fuel investments. And BP is one of the ones that have, I guess, in terms of oil and fossil fuel, is really sort of the first ones to come out for a full transition.
I like to say that when I argue with some of my eco-socialist friends, I tell them that there's no law of capitalism that I know of that says it has to burn carbon in order for its energy. It can get its energy any which way. It so happens historically that it went through water power and then carbon, and then uranium to get its the energy sources. But those are contingent. It's not ironclad. If you can find a way to get solar energy and other forms of renewable energies less expensively, which is happening now, they'll be more than happy to shift. The battleground then becomes not over whether you have renewable energies or not, but how they're deployed. Whether you do the global smart grid or not. Also over ownership. I was explaining to Cliff earlier. We have a good example of, here in Western Pennsylvania, we have a capitalist-owned wind farm. Well, out in Iowa, they have several wind farms out there. One of them is owned by the county. It's county-owned. And the county uses its ownership of it to have everybody vastly reduced energy prices, but they still have money left over, so they use it to fund the public schools. So here you begin to see two different lines or two approaches, even within the idea of how you're going to make use wind energy. And there's a capitalist way to do it, and then there's a way to do it that builds a bridge to a new order, a socialist or worker cooperative method. So then the battleground changes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that capitalism, by definition, can't do renewable energies. It certainly can.
Yeah, another part of that battleground is the working conditions of those who labor in the green economy. And in fact, a lot of green corporations today don't pay very good wages. They've already have transnational assembly lines in Malaysia and the Philippines, et cetera, for solar panels, et cetera. So that's another point of demarcation, I think, between the left and hopefully the center and sort of the neoliberal greens. Again, this question of you want to save the planet through exploiting labor, rather than seeing human beings and labor as part of nature. There is no separation there. So they really haven't made that leap in their thinking.
Just checking to see if we have any additional questions that have come in. Don't see any. Give a last chance for people to send in a question if you wish, before we begin to wrap up. BP's move into other forms of energy, other investments, is really a smart move. It's much preferable from the capitalist point of view to the alternative that some have advocated, namely the way to defeat the fossil fuel industries that have so much invested in the ground, in bringing oil out of the ground, would be to expropriate them. And that would be politically something hard to carry off, short of a revolution, but it is maybe sort of a last ditch measure.
When all else fails.
Exactly. So far in U.S. history, the largest expropriation of private property occurred with the abolition of slavery.
Right.
And it took a civil war to make that possible. Yeah. So I don't know that it would be possible in the foreseeable future to have expropriation of the fossil fuel industries. So their smarter move would be to follow BP's line and begin to diversify their investments.
Almost all of them have green arms within the corporation now. They're already pretty much invested in buying into or doing the research and development. That transition is happening. From political perspective, I think there's ways we can force them into that transition a lot quicker through taxation policies and legislative policies and, saying how much of the grid has to be dedicated to alternative energy and things like this. So that's what I see as part of the path forward, as part of the struggle with these neoliberal Greens, is that they want to slow the process down, actually. And I think we want to speed the process up, so that's one of the battles that we're being engaged in.
Well, we seem to have exhausted the questions that our audience has sent in. And let me ask whether Jerry or Carl have any final closing thoughts that you want to round off this discussion with, the points that maybe we glossed over.
I'd just like to stress the key question of organization. Some people say, well, we have to build a movement. I don't think that's quite right. I think capitalist outrages build movements for us, as we saw with the killing of George Floyd. Our task is within those movements that capitalist outrages cause for us. We have to fan the flames, but mainly we have to build organization. The movements will move in waves. They will ebb and they flow. And when they flow, you want to cast your net out. And when they ebb, you want to pull your net in to build organization. Because it will eventually, the upsurge will go down, but that way you have a strong organization. So you ride from one wave to the next, getting stronger and stronger all the time. That's the key question, I think, in doing this, is to build and start at the base community. You build a base community in your local area that you can use to develop some political clout to build a local Green New Deal majority, and then you can send people. Then you can build a network, an outward and upward at the same time to gain the kind of national impact and finally international impact for the. So it's got to be organized.
Yeah, I think there's about 15 million people took part in the George Floyd demonstrations. So out of that, we should look for a couple 100,000 to consolidate into organizational activity, permanent organizational activity, whether it's in the unions or the community or electoral. And I think if Biden wins, you'll see a pretty concerted push by AOC and those 91 congressmen and those handful of senators to really push the Green New Deal ideas and demand that there's a budget and money for them. And I think our role is starting to how do we interpret and apply that to the local conditions? How do we take that push from the national level and say, here's an opening here if in Pennsylvania or in Pittsburgh or Chicago or wherever. But I think the doors are starting to open. And Carl is right on when he talks about this organization that's going to push that door wider and make those changes possible.
And if the Democrats do win in November, there will be more than the 91 congressmen in the New Deal coalition. It will be much larger, or at least we hope.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let me thank both Carl Davidson and Jerry Harris for very thought-provoking discussions and very informative. I hope our audience enjoyed the program today. You should know that all of our revenue-raising programs have been canceled due to the coronavirus. Nevertheless, we continue to pay our Mexican staff. So if you can make a tax-deductible donation, please do so at our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Thanks to our team that helped put this and other webinars together: Betsy Bowman, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamant, Roberto Robles, Coletta Mora, and Olivia Canales. But special thanks to today's speakers. This program will be available on our website. If you want to review it again, or if you want to recommend it to others, they can watch it later by going to our website where it has been archived. Next Monday, we will have a representative from the Venezuelan embassy and journalist Tamara Pearson talking about COVID-19 and the economic war against Venezuela. That's something that there is very little good information about in the US media. And I think that you find it very interesting to hear from our speakers next Monday about the impact of this policy, which Elliot Abrams even has admitted has been a failure so far, but they're going to double down and keep trying to bring about regime change in Venezuela, as well as in Nicaragua and Cuba. So next Monday, 1 o'clock Central Time, please join us for this webinar on COVID-19 and the economic war against Venezuela. Thanks again for joining us today.